Have you ever wondered why there are four railroads in Monopoly, one on each side? If you look at a map of the railroads in the United States, we can see a pretty similar structure. Almost vein like in design, they zigzag around obstacles to move cargo around the country. Some people would describe them as the arteries of the nation, and I would have to agree. Around one third of all U.S. exports move by rail, and on average, they haul 1.7 billion tons of raw materials and goods a year. So, how did they get here? There's evidence of tracks being used thousands of years ago in ancient societies, the first modern use probably tracing back to mining carts. But that's not the whole story of how railroads tie into mining's history. Around 1769, an English inventor named Thomas Newcomen created a world changing device known as the steam engine to pump water out of flooded mines. Soon, a Scottish inventor named James Watt improved his device with the world's first power train, a method of taking the energy from steam and converting it into motion through a spinning wheel. In 1784, the first patent for a steam locomotive was produced, although the world wouldn't see a commercially successful track until 1812 in Leeds. Only 3 years later, the first charter in the United States would be granted to John Stevens. 15 years later, in 1830, the construction of the Baltimore and Ohio began. The first 14 miles of track opened that year. These are the components of a railroad track. The ground would first be shaped, and then long wooden beams weighing around 200 pounds called sleepers would be laid down. The rails are then placed and fastened to the sleepers and welded together. Soon, planning and construction of railroads started to progress very rapidly, at a cost. Early documentation about construction on railroads is sparse, but the first notable example I could think of would be Phineas Gage. On September 13th, 1848, Phineas Gage was employed at the Rutland and Burlington Railroad as a construction foreman. Around 4:30 p.m., he was working with explosives to clear land out of the way. While he had his mouth open speaking, the tamping iron used to ignite the powder caused a spark which sent its body, about 3 feet 7 inches long, weighing 13 pounds, through his left cheek up through the top of his skull. I say this example is notable because Phineas survived for another 12 years. He had suffered significant brain trauma, though, and the people that were close to him said he was no longer himself. The loss he suffered did help give rise to the birth of neuroscience and our understanding of the brain. Accidents like his also inspired Alfred Nobel to invent dynamite, which he would later regret because of its adoption in war. Alfred Nobel was so distraught over the damage his invention caused, he decided to create the Nobel Prize. During the American Civil War, the construction on the Transcontinental Railroad began. It was a race to connect both sides of the country together. In 1863, in Sacramento, workers for the Central Pacific Railroad first started breaking ground for the track. 11 months later, workers across the country began to do the same in Omaha. In only 6 years, this massive undertaking would be finished. Hailed at the time as an American achievement, most of the work would be done by Chinese immigrants and newly freed slaves. Indigenous people and bison would be relocated and extricated to make way for this coast-to-coast behemoth. The U.S. military at some points being needed to enforce this new arrangement. U.S. natives suffered casualties and lost their way of life, and bison, which were in the tens of millions at the time, were hunted to near extinction. The famous photograph of the Golden Spike ceremony, where a 17.6-carat golden spike was placed, only displayed white workers. There were no records of how many people lost their lives during the construction, but it is estimated to be up to 4,000. Chain gangs were introduced shortly after the end of the Civil War as punishment to prisoners to make up for the new laborer shortage. Put on public display, chained together, men would be forced to construct railroads and roads while at gunpoint, facing being shot or lashed. It wouldn't be until shortly after the horrors of World War II people would start to take notice to the cruelty and abolish the practice in every state by the 1950s. Almost a century later, long after most of the railways had been established. In 1926, the Railway Labor Act was introduced as an attempt at government oversight between disputes of the railway workers and the owners. This allowed the government to force railroad unions to try and reach a deal or continue working until they do, because of the massive interruption to commerce a railroad shutting down would cause. This effectively removed their ability to strike and allowed the government to intervene and declare it illegal. If they refuse and walk out without going through an extremely lengthy arbitration process that could be stalled indefinitely by a third party, then they are breaking the law. In 1936, the airlines were also included in this law, and along with the Taft-Hartley Act, actively prohibiting unions from engaging in politics and preventing many strike methods. The Taft-Hartley Act is what allowed President Reagan in 1981 to fire 11,345 striking air traffic controllers and use the military to fill in the shortage. Modern machinery has made laying new railroad tracks a trivial process like automation has in most industries, which is good because global warming is causing a lot of older tracks to buckle from the heat stressing the steel to expand, but the workers are still as exploited as ever. On November 30th, 2022, politicians voted to force a deal with the railroad union that did not include the sick days off they requested. Things may get bad if these critical employees to our nation have to refuse to work to get any leverage on the deal. Please consider this if in the next few weeks you see people striking or store shelves seeming to get empty, that these people, like many others, have been exploited for too long. In such a vital industry created on practically slave labor, we need to push our government to nationalize the industry and run it just like the post office. Cheap service with good benefits for the employees. Thanks for watching.